The year is 1789 and something is brewing in the air. Your rent is out of control. Groceries are so expensive that you haven't had a baguette in years. The rich are getting richer, and yet you're working harder than ever just to make ends meet. If this sounds familiar, it's because a lot of the challenges that we're facing today are what the people of France were facing in 1789, right before the French Revolution. And that's why understanding the French Revolution is really important right now. It's a mirror we can look into, a warning about what happens when a society ignores its breaking points. So join me as we recreate this iconic masterpiece and talk about what Americans should know about the French Revolution, this time on Painting the Past. Let's get started here. So before we dive into why the French Revolution is kind of a mirror to America today, I want to quickly talk through what I'm thinking with this painting. And by the way, if you're not into the painting, just use the chapters below to skip to the history. I get it, I'm not offended, I'm a history nerd too. But if you want to hear about the painting and what I'm thinking, I'm going to put it up on the screen now. And immediately, one of the things that jumps out to me is all of the movement and the violence and the turbulence. This painting was actually done in 1789. And one of the coolest things about that is that the artist really captured the emotion of what people were feeling in the moment. This isn't some piece that was done hundreds of years later. And I think you can feel that. And so for me, painting in watercolor, I want to think about how I can translate that emotion into the medium I'm using. Right away, what strikes me is the movement and the violence, and so I want to just be really loose with my first wash. I'm not worrying about staying close into the lines. I'm not worrying about sharp shapes or clear definition. For this first wash, I'm really just thinking about, what is the feeling and what is the atmosphere? And so really loosely, I can actually just start to lay in what I think is going to create this sort of loose and fast-moving environment, almost like we're dropped into the center of this war zone. There's fire, there's smoke, there's people running around. I want to capture that energy, and I'm actually working really fast in order to capture it. Once this is laid down and once this is dry, then I'll think about how can I go back and put in sharp lines using darker values. And doing that is going to help give some definition. And, we'll see how this goes. In pre-revolutionary France, life was pretty brutal for the average person. Most people lived in poverty, and a meager baguette was the staple of their diet. But after a series of poor harvests, bad weather, and economic mismanagement in the 1780s, the price of bread skyrocketed to as much as 90% of the laborers' daily wages. So people were literally starving, and meanwhile, rich people were throwing lavish parties. King Louis XVI's solution to this was to raise taxes on the poor while cutting taxes for the wealthiest one-percenters. Then came the tipping point. So on July 14th, 1789, Parisians who were fed up with the king, the price of food, and their own voicelessness took matters into their own hands. They stormed the Bastille, a prison that had long been a symbol of royal tyranny. I want to explain what the Bastille meant to people back then. It had a certain cultural significance that I can't help but draw certain parallels to modern-day detention facilities like the alligator Alcatraz. So the Bastille was a symbol of the king's regime. It was a place where due process went to die. Prisoners were sent there with no court hearings. There was little news that ever made it out of there. It was shrouded in mystery and deeply politicized. So it kind of makes sense that an angry mob would want to burn the Bastille down. But what did they want out of it? They had reached their breaking point with their government, but what future did they see for themselves? Well, we like to think that revolutions are tidy things. Angry people rise up, a new leader takes charge, and justice prevails. But history doesn't work that way, and neither does emotion. So after the storming of the Bastille in 1789, France erupted in revolutionary fervor. So peasants torched manor houses, nobles fled, and the king was forced to recognize the National Assembly, marking the collapse of royal authority. But by 1795, the revolution had descended into chaos, and a lot of those revolutionaries were exhausted. The public, who was once electrified by dreams of liberty and equality, was now sick of war, bloodshed, and broken promises. So into this disillusioned landscape emerged a young military hero named Napoleon Bonaparte, whose promise of order soon eclipsed the revolution's original ideals. Napoleon offers a fascinating case study into what happens when democratic institutions break down. So when people believe elections are rigged, courts are biased, and the media can't be trusted, they stop playing by the rules. They look for saviors, not systems, because they've lost faith in the system entirely. Napoleon came to power with a message that still echoes today. Only I can fix it. He promised efficiency, strength, and national pride. The French people, battered by instability, went along. He ended elections, he censored the press, and he crowned himself emperor. What's most striking is that many of the same people who had stormed the Bastille a decade earlier to topple a king ultimately supported Napoleon's authoritarian regime. Their lofty hopes for democracy had been crushed by years of terror, infighting, and disillusionment. In hindsight, maybe storming the Bastille wasn't the clean path to liberty that they imagined. It kicked off a decade of instability that left them willing to trade radical freedom for order. Napoleon, the war hero, promised to protect the revolution's gains, like the abolition of feudal privileges, while ending the chaos. And so, like many societies before and after, France traded their ideals of radical freedom for a strongman's promise of safety and stability, not unlike other moments in history when exhausted people embraced authority just to feel stable again. So while this painting dries, I want to share a few thoughts. As an American, I have to ask, is this where we're headed? After all, this is a pattern seen over and over again. History is filled with moments where exhausted or disillusioned societies embrace strong leaders who promise order over chaos, often at the expense of democracy or civil liberties. After decades of civil war, corruption, and political gridlock, many Romans welcomed Julius Caesar when he crossed the Rubicon and seized power in 49 BCE. His supporters believed he would restore stability and reform a broken system, and he effectively ended the Roman Republic. In the wake of Germany's crisis after World War I, Hitler followed that same pattern, lifting Germany out of depression at the expense of, world peace and 6 million Jews and general stability for planet Earth. And most recently, Putin rose to power in the chaos of the Soviet Union's collapse. So what do we do with this information? The French Revolution is a reminder of just how quickly things can unravel, even when people have good intentions. But it also reminds us of something powerful. People do have the ability to bring change. The storming of the Bastille was a messy and violent start to a future for France that nobody could have predicted when they were tearing these walls down. We're not storming fortresses in America today, but you can feel something simmering. Mistrust, fatigue, a general sense that the system just isn't working for people anymore. But unlike these people in 1789, we have the gift of hindsight. We can look back on moments like these and learn from our past before we let our emotions take charge. And I am going to do my best to not let emotions take charge as I try not to express my frustration with this painting. So I really like the Bastille. I think that pop of blue down in the left-hand corner just really brings that forward. And I can't take credit, the original painter did that, and it's just such a genius move. I also think that the fire in the distance brings a sort of glowing light that you just wouldn't get otherwise. I noticed that this painting was starting to get a little bit like blah, just kind of muddy and gross, which I expected because, as I mentioned, I was going to be really loose with the paints. But that fire just brings back some sharpness, which I love. One of the biggest challenges I had was getting the sense of movement and fighting and storming among the people down below. And maybe if I had been more patient, I would have actually just done even more people. I think maybe the problem is that there's just not quite enough of these suggestions of figures to give you that really intense feeling. But overall, I'm pretty happy with it, and mostly I'm happy with the Bastille. It's a good lesson in architecture, and one of the things I'm going to take away from this is when I do architecture, having an unusual pop of color, just like this blue here, is just such an interesting move. It's something I never would have thought of, and I'm going to do it again. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time on Painting the Past.